The wind howled across the cliffs as retired Marine Jack Dawson stared at the old lighthouse, its light long dead, its windows shattered by time. Beside him stood a stray German shepherd, fur bristling, eyes fixed on the tower as if it knew a secret. Jack had followed the dog for miles through the fog, not knowing why. Until now, something about that place called to him. Something buried in its silence. When he finally stepped inside, he discovered something no one had seen in decades. What was hidden within those crumbling walls would not only uncover a forgotten tragedy, but change his life forever. Stay till the end, because this story will break your heart and heal it all at once. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The wind off the Atlantic carried a salt-bitten chill that never seemed to leave the old harbor town. On the edge of that weather-beaten coast lived Jack Dawson, a retired Marine who'd traded the sound of gunfire for the slow rhythm of waves crashing against rock. His cabin sat a mile from the nearest neighbor, half hidden by pines with nothing but gulls and the sea for company. Most mornings, Jack rose before dawn, brewed black coffee, and stared through the fog until the first streak of sunlight broke across the horizon. It was his ritual, his way of reminding himself that the world was still turning even when he wished it would pause. Years had passed since his discharge, but the war never really left him. It followed in fragments. The echo of orders shouted in smoke, the faces of men who never came home, the sound of helicopters that still roared in his nightmares. He'd tell the locals he preferred the quiet, but truthfully, the quiet was the only thing that didn't ask questions. The townfolk respected him but kept their distance. To them, he was the man who fixed boats, the one with the scar on his temple and eyes that seemed to be listening to ghosts. Every so often, kids would wander near his property, curious about the soldier by the cliffs, but one sharp bark from his aging retriever was enough to send them running. When the dog died the previous winter, Jack buried him beneath the cedar tree and stopped talking for weeks. The silence afterward wasn't peace, it was punishment. He felt like the world had taken the last living thing that understood him. One evening, as the tide receded, Jack walked down to the shore carrying a lantern. The sea reflected dim light against the rocks, whispering secrets only old sailors could hear. He crouched beside a piece of driftwood and brushed away the sand. There, carved faintly into the wood, were the words, "Keep the light alive." He frowned, not recognizing the phrase but feeling it lodge somewhere deep inside his chest. Perhaps it was an old maritime saying, or maybe something left by a forgotten soul. Either way, it haunted him. That night, as he sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flame, Jack realized something strange. The loneliness that once felt safe now seemed heavier, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. And far in the distance, beyond the fog, a faint rhythmic barking echoed from the cliffs, as if calling his name. The next morning broke gray and cold, the kind of coastal dawn that painted everything in shades of silver. Jack stood by his truck, tightening a rusted bolt beneath the hood when he caught movement in the corner of his eye. At first he thought it was a shadow cast by the swaying pines, but then it stepped into the light. A German shepherd, lean but powerful, with a coat of sand and smoke, stood on the narrow dirt path that led toward the cliffs. Its ears were pricked, eyes sharp and intelligent, fixed directly on him. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and straightened. "You lost, buddy?" he called out. The dog didn't move. It stood like a statue, calm, alert, and oddly composed. There was something in its gaze that didn't belong to an ordinary stray. It wasn't fear nor hunger. It was recognition, the kind that sent an uneasy ripple through Jack's chest. He took a slow step forward, careful not to startle it, but the animal didn't retreat. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, studying him, then turned and trotted a few steps toward the cliffs before looking back, as if urging him to follow. Jack frowned. "What's your game, huh?" he muttered, but curiosity tugged at him. He took another step, then stopped when the dog barked once, sharp, commanding, purposeful. Not the bark of a lost pet, but of something trained, something that wanted to be understood. The sound echoed down the valley and was swallowed by the wind. For a moment he thought he saw a faint tag glinting beneath the fur around its neck, but when the dog shifted, the light vanished. It didn't wear a collar, no leash, no sign of ownership, and yet there was an uncanny confidence in the way it moved, as though it had a mission. When Jack tried to approach, the shepherd backed away, then barked again before sprinting up the trail that wound toward the high cliffs. Jack hesitated, half tempted to ignore it, but something deep inside whispered that this was no coincidence. So he tossed his wrench aside, grabbed his jacket, and followed. The fog was thicker near the cliffs, curling around the rocks like smoke. The dog's shadow flickered in and out of sight, leading him farther from the familiar path. Every few seconds it would pause and glance back, making sure he was still there. By the time Jack realized how far he'd gone, the sea roared beneath him and the lighthouse's broken silhouette loomed faintly through the mist. The dog stood at the edge waiting, its eyes glowing with purpose. And for the first time in years, Jack felt something stir inside him that wasn't emptiness. It was calling. The cliffs loomed higher with every step, and the fog thickened until the world shrank to the sound of his boots crunching over gravel. The German shepherd moved ahead with purpose, stopping only to glance back, making sure Jack was still following. Each time their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Trust mixed with unease. Jack didn't know why he followed, only that turning back felt wrong, like walking away from something meant for him alone. The trail wound through jagged rocks, slick with salt spray. Old wooden posts, remnants of a forgotten fence, leaned precariously along the edge. Jack brushed his hand across one and felt grooves carved into the wood, almost like claw marks. The dog sniffed near the same spot, tail stiff, ears twitching. Then it barked once and continued forward, faster this time. Jack grunted, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. "You better not be leading me off a cliff," he muttered under his breath. But the shepherd seemed sure-footed, weaving through narrow paths and thorny brush like it had walked this way countless times before. The farther they went, the more Jack noticed signs of abandonment. Rusted cables, a half-collapsed railing, and an old warning sign half buried in the dirt. Restricted area, lighthouse property. A memory stirred. He'd heard the locals mention an old lighthouse that had been decommissioned decades ago after a tragedy at sea. No one visited it anymore. Storms had nearly claimed it several times. The place was said to be haunted by the men who once kept its light burning. Jack shook off the thought, but a chill that wasn't from the cold settled in his bones. The dog suddenly stopped at a narrow outcrop overlooking the crashing waves. It stood perfectly still, staring into the fog. Jack followed its gaze but saw only white mist and the endless roaring sea. Then faintly, the outline of something began to emerge. A tall, crumbling tower, its peak cutting through the fog like a ghost from another era. The lighthouse. Jack froze. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. The shepherd turned to him, eyes gleaming with something that looked eerily like expectation. For a long moment, neither moved. The sea thundered below and the wind tugged at Jack's jacket. He had no reason to go any farther, yet his feet carried him onward. The dog barked once more, low and commanding, and though every instinct told him to turn back, Jack Dawson took his first step toward the forgotten lighthouse that would change everything. As Jack climbed the final stretch of the trail, the fog began to thin, unveiling the jagged beauty of the coastline. The German shepherd trotted ahead, its silhouette sharp against the rising sun. Then, out of the mist, the shape appeared, tall, weathered, and silent. The lighthouse stood like a ghost of another era, its white paint peeled by salt and time, its lantern long extinguished. The small keeper's quarters beside it leaned slightly toward the sea, as if bowing to the relentless wind that had battered it for decades. Jack stopped in his tracks. He had seen ruins before, war-torn villages, abandoned outposts, but this place carried a different kind of sorrow. It wasn't destruction born of violence, but of forgetting. "So this is where you wanted to bring me," he murmured. The shepherd looked back, tail low, eyes reflecting the golden light. It let out a quiet whine, then padded toward the rusted gate that blocked the entrance. A faded sign hung loosely from one hinge. "Coastal Authority property, do not enter." Jack ran his hand along the cold metal bars. The padlock was corroded, eaten away by years of salt air. He pushed lightly and it gave way with a groan. The dog slipped through first, tail brushing his leg as if encouraging him onward. Inside the fence, the ground was littered with seaweed, broken glass, and pieces of driftwood carried by storms. The air smelled of brine and rust. Jack stepped carefully, his boots crunching over forgotten memories. Every surface told a story. Footprints sealed in the concrete, initials scratched into the doorframe, a rusted lantern still hanging by the entrance. He reached the main door and hesitated. The paint had worn off completely, revealing dark, swollen wood beneath. "No one's been here in years," he whispered. The shepherd sat beside him, staring fixedly at the door, ears twitching. Then, with a low growl, it pushed forward, pawing at the frame. Jack took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open, releasing a gust of stale, cold air that smelled faintly of oil and sea salt. Dust motes drifted in the light streaming through a cracked window. The silence inside was thick, broken only by the faint hum of waves against the cliff. For a long moment, Jack stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of something larger than himself. The dog glanced back once more, as if to say, "You're home now." And as Jack stepped inside the forgotten lighthouse, the past began to breathe again. The heavy door groaned shut behind him, muffling the roar of the sea. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and rusting metal. The German shepherd padded ahead, paused silent on the dusty floorboards, its breath visible in the dim, cold air. Jack lifted his flashlight and swept its beam across the walls. Faded paint peeled in long strips, revealing wood darkened by decades of salt and moisture. Old nautical maps clung to the wall, their ink blurred and brittle. A shattered clock hung crooked above a rusted table, its hands frozen forever at 3:17. The light caught an old photograph nailed beside the stairwell, a black and white portrait of 3 men in uniform standing outside the same lighthouse. One of them had a dog sitting proudly by his side. Jack leaned closer, brushing away the dust. The soldier's face was weathered but familiar. Strong jaw, same eyes, same stubborn expression. His heart skipped. He looked almost like him. He took a step back, shaking the thought away. It had to be coincidence. The shepherd barked once, breaking his trance, then bounded up the narrow spiral staircase that twisted toward the lantern room above. Jack followed, each step creaking under his weight. The higher he climbed, the more the structure seemed to groan, as though protesting being disturbed after years of slumber. Rusted bolts jutted from the walls, and faded graffiti marked the bricks, names, dates, and fragments of messages. "Keep the flame. For the lost." Halfway up, Jack paused as his flashlight flickered. He tapped it twice before the beam steadied again. The shepherd stood ahead on the landing, staring at something on the floor. Jack crouched beside it, a small brass compass, its glass cracked but the needle still twitching. Someone had dropped it here long ago. He pocketed it instinctively, not knowing why. At the top, the room opened into a circular space where shattered glass from the lighthouse lens lay scattered across the floor like ice. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, carrying the faint echo of gulls. The dog sniffed around a corner, then pawed at a loose plank beneath a rusted toolbox. Jack knelt and pried it up. Beneath the floorboards, something metallic glinted in the beam of his flashlight. A small metal box. Old, dented, but sealed. Jack's pulse quickened. The shepherd sat beside him, tail still, eyes fixed on the box as though guarding it. For the first time in years, Jack felt his heart race not from fear, but from the pull of discovery. Something long buried beneath dust and silence was waiting to be found. Jack brushed the dust from the metal box, its surface dull and scarred by time. A faint engraving marked the lid, an insignia he recognized instantly, the emblem of the U.S. Marine Corps. His breath caught. What was a military artifact doing in an abandoned lighthouse miles from any base? The German shepherd sat beside him, ears perked, watching his every move. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic crash of waves far below, echoing through the hollow tower like a heartbeat. He tried to pry the lid open, but the hinges resisted, rusted shut after decades of neglect. "Come on," he muttered, digging through his pocket for his pocket knife. The blade slipped under the edge with a groan of protest, then, click. The lock gave way. Dust billowed up as he slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of objects that looked like pieces of another man's life. A weathered leather journal tied with string. A dog tag, its chain tangled around a folded photograph. Beneath them, a sealed envelope yellowed with age and stamped classified. Jack's pulse quickened as he reached for the photo. The edges crumbled in his hands. But the image was still clear. 2 soldiers standing side by side on a windswept cliff. Uniforms crisp, smiles faint but genuine. And there, sitting proudly between them, was a German shepherd. Jack's eyes narrowed as he studied the taller man on the left. The same square jaw, the same eyes. The resemblance was uncanny. It was like staring at an older version of himself. His hands trembled as he turned the photo over. On the back, written in fading ink, Captain William Dawson and Scout, 1943. Jack froze. William Dawson, his grandfather's name, the one who had vanished during the war, declared missing in action. His mother had spoken of him rarely, and when she did, her voice always carried a quiet sorrow. No remains were ever found. No answers. And now here, in this forgotten lighthouse, his past had come calling. He flipped open the leather journal. The handwriting was bold but hurried, words scrawled with the precision of a soldier documenting every breath. The first line read, "If anyone finds this, it means the light went out before it should have." Jack swallowed hard. The shepherd rested its head gently on his knee, as if sensing the storm building inside him. For years, Jack had carried the guilt of surviving battles others hadn't. But as he held the journal of a man who shared his blood, a strange feeling replaced the ache in his chest. Not fear, not sadness. It was destiny whispering through time, waiting to be heard. The journal's pages were brittle, each one heavy with history. Jack turned them slowly, his flashlight trembling as if afraid to disturb the ghosts inside. The handwriting, though rushed, carried strength, every letter carved with purpose. The first few entries described routine lighthouse work, weather reports, supply shipments, ships passing safely in the night. But then halfway through, the tone shifted. The sentences grew shorter, sharper. Fear began to seep through the ink. August 14th, 1943. Strange signals from the sea. Scout won't stop barking. The light keeps flickering even when the power is steady. I think someone's out there, Jack frowned. Scout, the German shepherd from the photo. His grandfather's dog. He read on, heart pounding. August 16th, radio transmission received. Distress call from an unknown vessel. Command orders silence until further notice. Something isn't right. They said this coast was clear, but I can feel it. We're being watched. The pages crackled as Jack turned them. His flashlight beam landed on a section marked by a dark stain. Old seawater or maybe something darker. August 18th. We intercepted coded messages. Possible enemy submarine offshore. I've sealed the northern storage with the documents. If anything happens, the truth must not be lost. Jack's throat tightened. His grandfather hadn't just kept the lighthouse. He'd guarded classified military intelligence during wartime. Maybe that was why he vanished. The next entry was smeared, almost unreadable. He squinted. August 19th, they found us. Scouts on edge. The light must stay on tonight. It's our only warning signal. If this is my last entry, may whoever finds this keep the flame alive. Jack closed the book slowly, his pulse roaring in his ears. The lighthouse groaned under a sudden gust of wind, as if the structure itself remembered that night. The German shepherd beside him whimpered softly, pacing in circles before sitting at his feet. He looked down at the dog, whispering, "You knew, didn't you?" The animal lifted its head, eyes glinting in the beam of the flashlight. Something about the way it stared at him made his skin crawl, not in fear but in awe, as if the same spirit that once guarded this place was still here, watching over it. Jack exhaled, a mix of sorrow and resolve filling his chest. His grandfather hadn't died in vain. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a legacy. And now, decades later, the same bloodline had returned to finish what was left undone. Jack sat on the cold floor of the lantern room, the journal still open on his lap. The last entry echoed in his head like a whisper carried through time. The storm outside had quieted to a low rumble, but inside the lighthouse everything felt alive, charged with memory. The German shepherd rested nearby, head on its paws, eyes locked on him as if waiting for him to understand something crucial. He traced the handwriting on the page, running his fingers over his grandfather's name. William Dawson, a man he had never met yet somehow felt he'd known all his life. They shared the same instincts, the same restlessness, the same unspoken burden of duty, but what truly shook him was the uncanny presence of the dog. He looked at the shepherd again, really looked this time. Its fur was streaked with silver, its stance confident but not aggressive. There was something in its gaze, a familiar intelligence, a loyalty that transcended the ordinary. Scout. Jack whispered the name from the journal. The dog's ears flicked up immediately. It rose, stepping closer, tail still. Jack's heart skipped. No, that's not possible. But logic didn't belong here, not in this forgotten place where time seemed to hold its breath. The journal told of a loyal companion who refused to abandon his post even after the light went out. And now, decades later, Another German shepherd had led Jack straight here, as if answering a promise made generations ago. He turned to the window. Through the cracked glass, the sea stretched endlessly, waves catching faint light from the hidden moon. Somewhere beyond that horizon, his grandfather's final mission had ended. And now, fate had guided Jack back to finish it. The dog suddenly barked once, sharp and urgent, breaking his trance. It padded to the base of the lantern mechanism, sniffing around the corroded gears. Jack followed and noticed a faint glint beneath the rusted metal. An old radio set, its wires tangled but intact. He brushed the dust away and stared. This was the same kind of model his grandfather mentioned in the entries. Static hissed softly through the speaker, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat trapped between worlds. Jack leaned closer, his pulse quickening. "What are you trying to show me, boy?" he murmured. The shepherd sat beside him, ears pricked toward the static, eyes unwavering. Jack realized then it wasn't just coincidence. The dog wasn't leading him to the past, it was bringing it back to life. A low rumble rolled across the horizon, followed by a flash that lit the fog like a camera burst. Jack looked up through the shattered dome of the lighthouse and saw lightning tearing through the sky. Within seconds, the wind howled again, sweeping through the cracks of the old tower and slamming the door below. The German shepherd barked sharply, pacing in circles, tail stiff and alert. The storm had returned, and it was no ordinary one. Rain lashed against the glass, the sound like 1,000 needles. Jack tried to steady the old radio set, brushing away water dripping from the ceiling. The device hissed with static, faint but alive, as if the storm itself was feeding it power. "Come on, talk to me," he muttered, twisting one of the corroded knobs. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then beneath the static, a faint rhythm emerged, like Morse code. Beeps, pauses, a pattern buried beneath the storm's growl. Jack froze. His grandfather's journal had mentioned coded transmissions the night before he disappeared. "No way," he whispered. The shepherd growled, low and uneasy, then barked toward the window as thunder rattled the walls. Outside, the ocean roared with fury, waves exploding against the cliffs. Jack could barely see past the rain, but every flash of lightning revealed fragments of the coast, jagged rocks, foaming water, and the silhouette of a ship far out at sea, tossed like a toy in the chaos. The sight made his stomach twist. "There's someone out there," he breathed. He turned back to the radio. The static cracked louder, and suddenly a voice broke through. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "This is Captain Dawson. If anyone hears this, protect the light." Jack's blood ran cold. The voice was old, grainy, yet achingly familiar. "Grandpa." His own voice trembled. He leaned closer, pressing the receiver to his ear. "They're coming. The light must not go out." The message cut off in a burst of static. The shepherd howled, the sound long and mournful, echoing through the tower like a cry from another time. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. Lightning struck nearby, shaking the floor beneath his boots. He grabbed the old lantern mechanism instinctively, trying to steady it as if keeping it alive could somehow honor the message. The storm outside intensified, screaming through the broken windows, but Jack no longer felt fear. He understood now, the message wasn't a ghost's voice. It was a call to action. And somewhere within that storm, the past was reaching out, demanding that the light be lit once more. The radio crackled again, filling the lighthouse with a restless hum. Jack's pulse thudded in his ears as he leaned closer, adjusting the corroded dial with trembling fingers. Static surged, then faded, followed by a faint voice, aged and ghostly, pushing through the interference. "Ade, Captain Dawson. Coordinates compromised." "Protect the light." He froze. The words weren't random, they were part of a transmission. His grandfather's final one. The German shepherd let out a soft whine, pacing near the base of the radio as if sensing the urgency in the air. Jack steadied his breath. "Talk to me," he whispered. "Please, just one more time." The radio sputtered, then hissed again. A click, a crack, and the voice returned, clearer now. "If anyone finds this, the mission failed. The message must stay hidden. The light guards more than ships, it guards the truth." Jack's hands tightened around the edge of the table. His heart raced. "The truth about what?" he murmured. But the voice didn't answer. The signal warped, then broke into rhythmic static once more. The shepherd barked sharply, pulling his attention toward a locker wedged behind the generator. Its metal was rusted and warped by years of salt air. Jack forced it open with his shoulder, sending dust and debris cascading to the floor. Inside, beneath an old lantern and a folded flag, lay a sealed envelope, its edges brittle but intact. A single phrase was scrawled across the front in faded ink. "To my future family." Jack's throat constricted. He sat down slowly, the weight of generations pressing on his chest. Hands trembling, he tore open the seal. Inside were 2 pages, one typed, one handwritten. The typed sheet bore a military crest and detailed a classified operation during the war. An enemy vessel carrying stolen intelligence was intercepted near the coast. But the ship never reached port. It vanished, near this very lighthouse. The handwritten letter beneath was different, personal, raw. "If my blood ever finds this place, know that duty runs deep, but love runs deeper. I stayed to protect what mattered, but I never stopped believing someone would finish what I began. Keep the light alive, always." Jack's vision blurred as he read the final words. He looked up at the German shepherd, whose steady gaze seemed to hold understanding beyond the natural. His grandfather's voice had crossed decades to find him. And in that storm-torn lighthouse, Jack Dawson finally understood. The light wasn't just a beacon for ships. It was a legacy calling him home. Jack read the letter again, this time aloud, his voice shaking as it filled the empty tower. "If my blood ever finds this place." He paused, swallowing hard. Every word felt alive, as if his grandfather was there beside him, whispering through the wind that rattled the cracked windows. The German shepherd stood quietly at his side, its gaze steady, its ears twitching with every word. The storm outside had weakened, but the lighthouse still moaned under the weight of the wind. The lantern above them creaked in the rafters, a ghost of its former glory. Jack folded the letter gently, placing it beside the journal and dog tag. His heart pounded, not from fear but from the overwhelming truth that had finally surfaced. His grandfather had not abandoned his post. He had died protecting something sacred. He turned the envelope over and noticed a small ink mark at the corner, a symbol that matched one he had seen in the journal's final page. A circle with a cross of light through it. His mind raced. "The light guards the truth," he whispered. What if it wasn't just symbolic? Driven by instinct, Jack grabbed his flashlight and scanned the lantern housing above. Years of grime coated the glass, but when he wiped away a layer, he noticed faint etchings carved into the metal rim. Coordinates. They matched the longitude and latitude written in the classified document. "It's all connected," he muttered, breath fogging the glass. The message, the map, the light, it was all part of the mission. He looked down at the shepherd. He hid something here, didn't he? The dog wagged its tail once, then trotted toward a section of the floor beneath the spiral staircase, sniffing feverishly. Jack followed, crouching beside the dog. The floorboards looked uneven, newer than the rest. He pried one loose and found a small compartment beneath. Inside lay a sealed metal tube, perfectly preserved, stamped with the same insignia. Jack pulled it out carefully, heart hammering. He unscrewed the cap, revealing a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Old, fragile, but unmistakably military intelligence reports. His grandfather had protected them even in death. Jack sat back, staring at the relics of a man's devotion. The letter's words echoed in his mind. "Keep the light alive." He finally understood. It wasn't just about illumination. It was about remembrance, duty, and sacrifice. Tears welled in his eyes as the shepherd pressed its head against his arm. Jack whispered softly, "You did it, Grandpa. The light's safe." And in that moment, as thunder rolled far away across the ocean, he felt something warm and unexplainable, like the tower itself was finally at peace. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a ghostly calm that hung over the cliffs. Moonlight slipped through the broken windows of the lighthouse, painting long silver streaks across the floor. Jack stood near the old lantern housing, the metal tube of documents clutched in his hand. The German shepherd sat beside him, still and watchful, as if sensing that the air itself was holding its breath. He placed the relics on the table and looked up at the lantern above. For the first time in decades, he imagined it alive again, its beam slicing through the dark sea, guiding lost ships to safety. "Keep the light alive," he whispered. The words echoed softly through the chamber, blending with the sigh of the wind. Then, something shifted. The temperature dropped. The faint hum of the wind turned into a rhythm, like footsteps circling the upper walkway. Jack froze. The dog's ears snapped forward, a low growl vibrating from its throat. He turned slowly, every muscle in his body tense. A faint glow began to pulse from the lantern's glass, soft, golden, almost like the light of dawn. Within that glow, a figure started to take form, a man in an old Marine uniform standing tall beside another German shepherd. The spectral dog looked almost identical to the one at Jack's side. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Grandpa." The vision was faint, shimmering like mist caught in sunlight. Captain William Dawson stood at the top of the staircase, one hand resting on the railing, the other on the ghostly dog's back. His eyes met Jack's, steady, calm, proud. There was no fear in them, only peace. Jack took a hesitant step forward, emotion tightening his chest. "I found it," he said softly. "The mission, the documents, everything." The apparition didn't speak, but the light around it pulsed brighter, filling the chamber with warmth. The ghostly shepherd turned its head toward the living one, tails flicking in silent acknowledgement. Two guardians separated by time, reunited for a moment beyond reason. Tears welled in Jack's eyes. The weight of decades, the guilt, the loneliness, the unanswered questions melted into something lighter. Gratitude, understanding. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vision began to fade. The ghostly man lifted his hand in salute. The light flared once more, then vanished, leaving only the whisper of the sea below. Jack stood motionless, breath trembling. The German shepherd nudged his hand gently, grounding him in the present. And for the first time in years, Jack Dawson didn't feel alone. He felt watched over, protected. The light wasn't just a beacon anymore, it was a bridge between souls still burning in the dark. The first rays of dawn crept across the horizon, brushing the sea with streaks of gold and crimson. The storm had passed, but the lighthouse still stood battered, its walls cracked, its glass shattered, its silence profound. Jack stood at the top of the spiral staircase, hands resting on the railing, staring at the lantern above him. The German shepherd lay at his feet, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. The ghostly encounter still burned in his memory, but what lingered most was not fear. It was purpose. Jack took a slow breath, then stepped toward the lantern housing. The machinery was old, rusted and half broken, but the structure was intact. "Let's see if you can shine again," he murmured. His voice echoed faintly, merging with the distant crash of waves. The dog rose and padded beside him, eyes alert, tail swaying gently. He wiped the grime from the glass, revealing the faint etchings of his grandfather's coordinates. The generator, buried beneath years of dust, groaned as he turned the crank. Sparks flickered, small and hesitant at first. Then, with a deep hum, the ancient light flickered to life. Dim but alive, its beam slicing through the early morning fog. Jack stepped back, staring in awe. The shepherd barked once, tail wagging, as if celebrating the moment. Jack smiled through tears he didn't realize had fallen. "You did it," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the dog or to the spirit that still lingered here. Outside, the sea glowed with the reflection of the revived beam. It swept across the water like a hand reaching out, guiding invisible ships that might never pass again. But for Jack, that light was more than signal, it was redemption, for the guilt he'd carried from his own battles, for the belief that he'd lived while better men had not, for the silence that had once chained his soul. He placed his hand on the warm metal, eyes closed. "You kept the flame alive, Grandpa," he murmured. "Now it's my turn." The German shepherd rested its head against his leg, a quiet symbol of loyalty and peace. The ghosts of the past had been heard, their watch complete. As the sun rose higher, the beam grew brighter, stretching far beyond the cliffs into the open sea. And for the first time in years, Jack Dawson felt the weight lift from his heart. The light was no longer just his grandfather's legacy, it was his own. Morning sunlight spilled over the cliffs, bathing the coastline in warmth for the first time in days. The storm's fury had washed everything clean. The rocks gleamed, the sea shimmered like glass, and the air smelled of salt and renewal. From the distance, the lighthouse stood proud again, its long-forgotten beam sweeping rhythmically across the horizon. It was no longer a ruin. It was alive. Down on the shore, villagers gathered, pointing toward the light that hadn't shone in decades. "Someone's restored it," one man said in awe. Rumors rippled through the crowd. Some said it was the Coast Guard. Others whispered of ghosts returning to their post. But none knew the truth, that a lone veteran and a faithful German shepherd had brought the past back to life. Inside the keeper's quarters, Jack sat by the window, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. He watched the light's reflection dance over the waves, each rotation marking a heartbeat of peace. The shepherd, now named Echo, slept near the hearth, paws twitching as if dreaming of the night storm. Jack smiled faintly. "Rest easy, buddy," he said softly. "You've earned it." The once empty space now felt like home. The walls, once peeling and gray, carried warmth again. Tools and ropes were neatly stacked, and an American flag, cleaned and mended, hung proudly by the door. Jack had made a decision. He would stay. The lighthouse wasn't just a monument to his grandfather's sacrifice anymore. It was a promise, a vow to continue guarding the light for those still searching through life's storms. A knock sounded at the door. It was the harbor master, hat in hand, his eyes full of curiosity. "Heard the lights working again," he said. "That you're doing?" Jack nodded humbly. The man smiled. "About time someone brought her back. The sea's safer with that beam shining again." After he left, Jack walked outside with Echo trotting beside him. The breeze carried the cry of gulls and the distant murmur of waves. He stood at the edge of the cliff, sunlight warming his scarred face, and felt something he hadn't known in years: contentment. He looked down at Echo. "We'll keep it burning," he said quietly. The dog wagged its tail, eyes bright, and as the lighthouse beam swept once more over the endless sea, Jack Dawson knew this was more than a duty, it was a rebirth. The soldier had found his peace. The light had found its keeper. Weeks passed, and the once-forgotten lighthouse was no longer silent. The hum of restoration filled its halls. Fresh paint covered the walls, new glass sparkled in the lantern room, and the scent of oil and sea blended into something timeless. Jack had kept his promise. He repaired every beam, every stair, every bolt, determined to preserve both the tower and the story it carried. Now, travelers and fishermen often stopped by, drawn by the beam that once again guarded the coast. Some came out of curiosity, others to thank the man who'd revived it. But Jack never spoke much of how he'd found the place. He'd simply smile, gesture toward the sea, and say, "The light called me home." Echo, the loyal German shepherd, had become somewhat of a legend himself. Locals swore they'd seen him standing guard at the cliff's edge each night, gazing toward the water with a stillness that felt sacred. Children would visit, bringing him scraps of food, and he'd accept them politely before returning to his post, as if he were watching for something only he could see. Inside, Jack kept a small wooden box on the mantel. Inside it, the journal, the letter, and his grandfather's dog tag. Every evening, before lighting the lantern, he'd open the box and whisper, "Thank you," his voice soft, full of gratitude. Then he'd turn the crank and the beam would ignite, stretching across the ocean like a bridge between the living and the lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the waves, a soft breeze swept through the lighthouse. Jack sat by the window sipping coffee, Echo at his feet. The light's rotation washed over them, casting gold across the walls. For a fleeting moment, Jack swore he saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs, a man in an old marine coat, hand raised in salute. Behind him, a faint silhouette of another shepherd shimmered in the glow. Jack smiled, his heart full, unafraid. The image faded, but the warmth lingered. He looked down at Echo. "They're still out there," he said quietly. "Still keeping watch." The dog's ears perked, and for a moment Jack could have sworn Echo nodded. Outside, the beam swept once more across the endless sea, unwavering and eternal. It didn't just guide ships anymore, it told a story. Of loyalty, of courage, of love that even time couldn't silence. And as night fell over the coast, the light burned steady and bright. Because some lights, like some souls, never die.